The guilty were paraded in front of the hushed crowd and punishments were handed out. Autos de fe were deliberately stage-managed to be a grand theatrical display of the power of the Inquisition, and many reached Super Bowl scale. Like the civil authorities, the Inquisition had a variety of punishments at its disposal, from imprisonment to banishment to death. But it also had some uniquely peculiar punishments. In the San Benito penance, the guilty party was forced to wear a loose vest emblazoned with a diagonal red cross. This branded the wearer a heretic. Convicted heretics had to wear the San Benito at all times, a humiliation to the wearer, unable to escape the constant public gaze. But that was the point. It was a punishment that was also a deterrent, a reminder to others of the price paid for falling foul of the Inquisition. But the ultimate penalty was death by fire. Burning at the stake was reserved for two kinds of victims: determined, obstinate heretics who simply refused to cooperate, and repeat offenders. In the days of the Inquisition, 2 strikes and you were most definitely out. To avoid staining their hands, the Inquisition didn't carry out the sentence of death. Instead, they handed the accused over to the civil authorities, who inflicted the sentence. Even at the end, there was still a glimmer of hope for the convicted heretics. If they confessed their sins, they could escape being burnt alive. But the reprieve was being strangled to death instead. A grisly option, but one that many took. Refusing to confess meant the fire would be lit and an agonizing death was imminent. The records do not disguise the gory details of death at the stake.
When the flames attacked him, he bent, twisted, and writhed till he could no more. He was as fat as a suckling pig and burnt internally, so that, after the flames left him, he continued burning like a hot coal, and bursting open, his entrails fell out like those of Judas.
People could be tried and punished by the Inquisition, even if they were already dead. Hundreds of people were convicted and burnt at the stake in effigy long after they had died. The justice and effectiveness of the Inquisition had to be seen to be done. "500 years later, it's hard to accurately gauge how many people died at the hands of the Inquisition. The records are incomplete. But modern academics are now realizing that there has been a great deal of exaggeration, especially regarding the use of the torturer.
The Inquisition authorities really didn't like this very much because it meant bringing somebody in from outside. And it would be somebody who was considered coarse and uneducated. And the Inquisition did not want this sort of person interfering or having anything to do with the process of investigating heresy and conduct, the people's souls and all the rest of it.
We have very firm figures for torture. At certain periods, it's used extensively in the 17th century, but for very, very short periods, and even then by extensively, I mean possibly as much as 5 or 6% of prisoners might be tortured. But in total, the number of cases is very, very, very small indeed.
Torture was reserved for only the most serious cases of heresy, but there's no doubt that torture was practiced. But I suspect then, as now, people have exaggerated the use of torture, and in a sense that's the Inquisition's fault. Its proceedings weren't public. It had its own prisons, but nobody quite knew what went on in them. And so when you don't know what's happening, you always imagine the worst.
Does this mean that our inherited view of the Inquisition is wrong? Chances are the answer is yes. The reason? Propaganda. Anti-Spanish, anti-Catholic propaganda, known by academics as the Black Myth or the Black Legend.
The Black Legend was propaganda created deliberately by the English government and by the Dutch authorities in the 16th century. And as a result, clearly they exaggerated everything and in that way convinced the rest of the world that Spain was a bad country.
The Black Legend originated as Spain was establishing itself as a formidable power in the Americas. Spain's rivals in the New World, the English and the Dutch, were both Protestant countries who used the activities of the Spanish Catholic Inquisition, particularly its use of torture, as a way to blacken the name of their enemy. It was good political and religious spin.
The Black Legend was a response, I think, to Spain's growing power in the 16th centuries. Partly it referred to Spain's oppressive empire in Europe, in Italy, and later in the Netherlands. And it also referred to the ways in which the Spaniards conquered the New World and tried to enforce their way of life and, of course, their brand of Christianity. So I think the Black Legend is the idea that Spain will use cruelty to extend Catholicism.
This view was most definitely not shared by native Spaniards. They had come to rely on the Inquisition. It provided them with a clear Catholic national identity. The Spanish Inquisition had public support, which is why it lasted for over 300 years. During that time, the Inquisition's attention shifted. For the first 50 years, it focused on the conversos, but after that, it succeeded in finding heretics in other communities.
And at times, the Inquisition looks like a monster that has to find new ways of feeding itself. At first, it confines its interest mainly to Jews. Then it starts looking at the practices of Moors. In the 1520s and onwards, it looks at the activities of potential Lutherans or Protestants in Spain. And then, in the second half of the century, it reinvents itself once more and starts, if you like, looking into the bedroom, finding out what ordinary Christians are doing with each other, what they're saying to each other, and just how they're behaving.
For most ordinary Spaniards, the Inquisition was vitally important. They believed that because it had been originally instigated by the Pope, it was God's work. To reject the Inquisition was to reject the will of God. Who would do that in what was now a thoroughly Catholic country?
First of all, we can't ignore that for many ordinary Spaniards, the Inquisition, the Holy Office, was going about a good Christian task. It was protecting them from the possibility of infection from heresy. It was setting standards for behavior in the community. It was trying to prevent antisocial behavior, as we might say today. But I think there's another reason, and that is, who would have the political courage to abolish the Inquisition?
Initially, that political courage came from outside Spain. French armies, commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded and conquered Spain in 1808. One of Napoleon's first acts was to disband the Inquisition. He objected to a religious body having precedence over civil authorities. But the French presence was short-lived. The Spanish soon recaptured their territories and immediately reinstated the Inquisition. But just as surely as the fires of the auto-da-fe subsided, so too did the Inquisition. Even though it was re-established in 1815, the world had changed. It was a very different place to how it had been in the late 15th century. The Inquisition didn't have the momentum to survive for long.
The rest of Europe, and with it Spain, ceased to believe in heresy A high proportion of the population do not treat heresy seriously. The Inquisition is no longer punishing people, so it runs out of time, and they eventually abolish it because of political reasons. They see it as not being consonant with the progressive image which they now wish to project to Europe.
On July the 15th, 1834, Spain's monarch finally dissolved the Spanish Inquisition. The name of that monarch was Isabella II. It was almost as if the Inquisition had come full circle, and although we may have received a distorted history of the Inquisition's torturous ways, it still has a very potent legacy. Inquisitions have not stopped, and religion, race and politics continue to fuel conflict across the globe. Catholic and Protestant tensions in the north of Ireland, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, or the Taliban using religion as a means of imposing political power in Afghanistan. All of these inquire into the souls of their neighbors to see if they share the same beliefs and challenge the notion that differences will be tolerated. But we don't have to travel that far to realize how easily an inquisition can be born.
What was George Orwell writing about when he wrote his book 1984, about Big Brother, who wanted to control not only what you said or did, but what you thought? You can see it, after all, in the United States in the early 1950s in terms of the Hollywood Inquisition or the Un-American Activities Committee.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen...
I think the Spanish Inquisition is, in a sense, still with us. I think whenever people feel that civil liberties, even in modern democracies, are threatened, they know how bad, or at least they think they know how bad things can become, because they have the image of the Spanish Inquisition at the back of their minds.
Perhaps that's what Pope John Paul II had in mind when, in April 2000, on a visit to the Holy Land, he apologized for 2,000 years of Catholic violence, persecution and blunders. He asked for forgiveness for the use of violence that some have committed in the service of truth, against the Jews,